The moon landing hoax is a persistent and controversial theory that challenges one of the most celebrated achievements in human history. Today, more than 5 decades after the Apollo 11 mission, around 20% of people either completely deny or have some doubt that the moon landing was real. According to hoaxers, on July 16, 1969, instead of embarking on a historic journey to the moon, a select group of government officials, filmmakers, and the renowned Hollywood director Stanley Kubrick convened in the Nevada desert and orchestrated an intricately staged moon landing, complete with fabricated footage and photographs. The hoaxers argue that the entire event was staged because the American government was losing the space race against the Soviet Union during the Cold War and desperately needed a win to assert their dominance in space exploration. The space race was a 20-year competition between two nations. The pursuit for both was the domination of spaceflight technologies. It was a remarkable time in history, with many achievements in science, space exploration, and technology. Following the Second World War in 1946, tensions rose between the Soviet Union and the United States due to differences in political beliefs. Communism versus capitalism. This conflict became known as the Cold War. The term cold meant that there was no direct fighting between the two sides, but each sponsored and supported many conflicts across the world. The Americans and the Soviets both competed to prove their technological and intellectual superiority over the other. Winning the space race was considered vital by the two nations, as it showed the world which country had the superior scientific, economic, and political systems. With no official measure of success, the winner of the space race is a point of controversy. Most agree that it ended on July 20, 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon for the first time. The event was broadcast live on television, with over 700 million people watching worldwide. Despite the historic achievement, skepticism and conspiracy theories began to circulate almost immediately. Some began to question the authenticity of the mission, suggesting it was staged to boost American prestige during the Cold War. Conspiracy theorists began to cite anomalies in the film and photographs taken during the mission, claiming many inconsistencies and claiming that the footage was instead staged on Earth. Why are there no stars in these photographs? It must be a backdrop. The absence of stars is a result of the camera equipment and settings used during Apollo missions. The shutter speeds were configured to be very fast to capture the brightly lit surface of the moon without the risk of overexposure, making faint stars almost invisible in the background. The reason why the cameras were optimized this way is so that the moon's surface would be the primary subject in the photographs, rather than the stars in the distance. Hoaxers say that the stars were intentionally removed because astronomers would be able to use the constellations to determine whether the photos were taken from Earth or the moon. But the actual reason for not being able to see the stars in the photograph is the same reason why you can't see the stars in a city at night, because of all the light pollution. Light pollution reduces the contrast between the dark background of the night sky and the faint light given off by stars. When the sky is too bright due to extra light, even moderately bright stars become less visible. Why do photographs have sharp shadows that are inconsistent in length and direction? This must be from multiple studio lights. On Earth, our atmosphere scatters the sunlight, creating diffused and softer shadows that are more uniform. The moon, however, has no substantial atmosphere, so sunlight reaches the surface without scattering. As a result, shadows on the moon are much sharper and more defined than those on Earth. The sun is the moon's only source of light, so the length and direction of shadows on the moon are determined by the angle of the sun. The moon by nature has a very reflective surface, and along with the bright, white, reflective astronaut suits and equipment, disperses the sunlight into different directions, giving the illusion of multiple light sources. Why are some crosshairs behind objects? Those objects must have been added later. The appearance of the crosshairs being behind some objects is because these are blown-out copies of the original negatives, a common occurrence in the printing process. This phenomenon is due to overexposure during printing and causes brighter areas to leak into darker areas, causing slight distortions in the photographs. If there is no atmosphere on the moon, and therefore no wind, why is the flag waving? NASA made a custom flag for the Apollo missions that had a horizontal rod at the top so the flag wouldn't hang and instead would appear to be waving proudly. However, the pole that was supposed to hold the flag straight was accidentally bent during the trip, and so it didn't pull out all the way, making it look as if the flag was in motion. Another reason why the flag appeared to wave was because when the astronauts inserted the flagpole into the lunar surface, they twisted it back and forth to get it through the soil. In the airless environment of the moon, there is no atmosphere to dampen or stop the motion, so the flag continued to move for some time after the astronauts released it. Worried that it would fall after they twisted it into the ground, they quickly took the photo, capturing the flag while it was still moving. The astronauts couldn't have survived the Van Allen radiation belt on their journey to the moon. Earth is surrounded by a zone of charged particles which has serious radiation concerns for the astronauts passing through it. Professor Anu Oja replied to this claim by explaining that anyone who has ever done firewalking knows that you must pass through it as quickly as possible. That way, the thermal conductors in your feet don't absorb enough energy to burn you. It's the same concept for astronauts passing through the Van Allen radiation belt. The transit time was incredibly short and therefore posed no danger to the astronauts. Why was there no blast crater beneath the lunar module? A genuine moon landing would have left behind a substantial impact. The absence of a blast crater is due to deliberate engineering decisions to gently land on the moon instead of crashing down onto it. The astronauts traveled horizontally for a while, so the thrusters weren't pointing down and therefore wouldn't have kicked up much dust. The descent engines of the lunar module were also purposefully throttled down just before landing. They didn't need to use a large blast to slow themselves down because the moon's gravity is 1/6 of Earth's. This reduced the impact force, preventing the creation of a large crater on the lunar surface. What about wires? The astronauts look like they're being pulled. The odd-looking movements observed in lunar videos are a direct result of the unique conditions on the moon, where the gravitational pull is much weaker than on Earth. On the moon, astronauts and their gear weigh only about 1/6 of what they did on Earth. This reduced weight contributes to the appearance of higher jumps, slower descents, and easier manipulation of objects. Astronauts on the moon are often seen moving in a bouncing or floating manner. This is because they can cover greater distances with each step due to the lower gravity. The stiffness of their spacesuits also affects their movements, making the walking style appear very different from what we are accustomed to on Earth. What about Neil Armstrong's boot print? It doesn't match other images of his boot and it looks suspiciously well preserved. The astronauts wore lunar overshoes over their boots. Those overshoes were treaded, while the actual boots were not. After completing the moonwalk, Armstrong and Aldrin left the overshoes behind to save weight on the spacecraft so they could bring back more samples. Every gram of unnecessary items they could leave behind meant that they could bring back an additional gram of lunar samples. So, it was indeed Armstrong's boot print. When they walked on the moon during the Apollo 11 mission, their boot prints in the lunar regolith were crisp and well-defined. The lack of atmosphere on the moon means there is no air to cause particles to disperse or be eroded, preserving the shape of the boot prints over long periods of time. What about the lost tapes? Why did NASA tape over the original Apollo 11 footage? The term taped over is somewhat misleading. NASA did not intentionally erase or tape over the original Apollo 11 footage. During the early days of space exploration, telemetry tapes, the original tapes that recorded mission data, were often reused due to budget constraints and the high cost of magnetic tapes at the time. The Apollo missions generated vast amounts of data, and to conserve storage space and reduce costs, NASA sometimes reused tapes after the data had been successfully transmitted, processed, and archived. NASA has since made efforts to recover and restore as much of the original Apollo mission footage as possible. Why didn't we ever go back? Apollo 17, the last Apollo mission to land astronauts on the moon, took place in 1972. Since then, humans have never returned. This doesn't mean we never went to the moon in the first place. In the 1970s, NASA wanted to establish a permanent lunar base before turning to the next major space exploration challenge, Mars. But it never happened, simply because their priorities changed. After the Apollo missions, NASA's focus shifted to other goals and projects, such as the Space Shuttle program, the International Space Station ISS, and unmanned exploration of the rest of the solar system. Another reason we haven't been back is because it hasn't been funded. Human space missions are extremely expensive, costing between $50 and $100 million to send one astronaut into space. Long-term goals for human space exploration, such as sending humans to Mars, have shifted attention and resources away from more missions to the moon. Advances in robotics and unmanned space travel can provide the same valuable scientific data without the cost and risk associated with sending humans. Between 1969 and 1972, 6 Apollo missions brought back 382 kilograms or 842 pounds of lunar rocks, pebbles, sand, and dust from the moon. These samples are the most tangible and irrefutable pieces of evidence. The fact that these rocks have been distributed to scientists and educators all over the world to study and examine speaks to the transparency and openness of the scientific community. Scientists worldwide, who have no motive to lie, have verified that these rocks came from an environment that had no atmosphere or oxygen. Moreover, the Soviets, who were rivals of the US in the space race, eventually acknowledged and congratulated the achievements of the Apollo program. This recognition, begrudgingly or not, adds an extra layer of credibility to the moon landings. The space race had a broader impact on society than just space exploration. Earth is now surrounded by a network of satellites, which provide broadband communications and high-definition television, data used for weather reporting, and GPS navigation and positioning. Many of these tools and systems were created and developed during the space race. The image processing used in CAT scans and radiography were both initially developed for deep space imaging and photography. NASA's innovations into shock-absorbent materials also helped create more functionally dynamic artificial limbs. The world's first portable computer and mouse were created for space exploration and then adapted for the commercial markets. Even the wireless headsets we use today originate from NASA, creating hands-free equipment for astronauts and pilots. In today's world, where skepticism is on the rise and the internet acts as both a source of information and a battlefield for conflicting views, the moon landing hoax continues to spark debates and gain traction. However, the truth is that the moon landing was an extraordinary human achievement and remains a testament to human ingenuity and the pursuit of knowledge.